This training will inspire you to re-examine how you look at and respond to classroom management, behavior management, and developmental delays, and will provide practical interventions to help you support and develop student resilience, protective factors, and skills. Clark Fairbanks is the Assistant Director of Youth Emergency Services, locally known as the Yes House, and a certified ACEs and trauma-informed care trainer. His career has spanned more than 35 years working with youth and families. He began in 1985 at a youth corrections facility while he was a social work student at Bemidji State University. I hope I said that right, Clark. You can correct me if I didn't. He transitioned to Evergreen House, a runaway and homeless youth program where he progressed from a part-time youth advocate to the executive director. In 1992, Clark moved to Wyoming and served as the executive director of the Yes House. From 2005 to 2010, he was the superintendent of the Wyoming Girls School. He returned to Yes House in 2011 as the assistant director, where he continues to pursue his passion for improving the care and treatment of youth and families through training and advocacy. Wendy Gaunter is from Gillette, Wyoming. She is an adoptive mother, educator, and community advocate. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in education and a Master of Science in adult learning and technology. Wendy is a trained yoga instructor, community educator for mindfulness-based stress reduction, and a presenter for ACE Interface in neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience and protective factors for families. Wendy graduated from the Gillette Area Leadership Institute in 2004 and is a past National Teacher Policy Institute Fellow. She was a special educator and teaches parenting for Climb, Wyoming. Please welcome Clark and Wendy.
Thank you. It's great to have everybody connected to us today, and we look forward to our training.
Oh, this is our look of who's starting, and I think it might be me. So we're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences today. We're going to take you through the neurological impacts and biological impacts of chronic toxic stress. We're going to talk about the ACE survey and some of the pertinent data that we want to share with you. And then we're going to talk about some practical tips and tools that we can use in our classrooms. So to begin, we're going to talk about one of the largest health discoveries of our time, and that is understanding how adverse childhood experiences affect us.
Of course, my clicker quit working. Right? There we go.
Yep.
I'll change the battery because
Okay.
it's just working.
So as Clark does that, what we'll talk about, oh, you got it? You're fast.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So what we're going to talk about is trauma and chronic toxic stress are stored in our bodies. And that has been researched and verified through various experiments over time. Are you ready? And what we know is that neurodevelopmentally, our brains, our spinal cord, and all of these neurological processes in our body are taking in information. And so a child who happens to be in an environment that is toxic, that is chaotic, that will then impact their neurological and biological development. Okay, so synaptically, at birth, when we look at the synapses, there's not much going on. Infants are not really able to do much other than to try and communicate through crying whether they're hungry, whether they're tired, whether they're uncomfortable. And parents often, through nurturing, will learn what do those cries mean and will respond adequately to that child. Elementary age children have an arborization or this explosion of synaptic learning. So all their brain synapses are wiring all the time, taking in new information and making pathways that we hope will develop over time into very hardened neurological pathways, meaning they become like ski tracks. But at the elementary age, they're just growing and growing and growing all of these connections. In puberty, what happens is you can see there's a pruning process. And it is called pruning, but it's important to recognize that what starts to happen in puberty is this is a very intense developmental process. And the acceptance that this is a developmental process is fairly new, and its impact on the children who are, for example, 9 to 13 years old. It's really important to remember their brains are not working as optimally as they were in elementary school. So what's happening is now this myelization is happening. So these neural pathways are becoming more efficient. So if you think about a big traffic jam, and then you think about a city putting in all these different roadways to make it more efficient, that's what's happening. And then the myelization comes and it encases these neural pathways so that they become more and more permanent. And so just acknowledging that our brains have a lot of plasticity, but during adolescence, it's kind of like when your computer says it's updating. Have you ever had that? You go to your computer to do something, it's like, just a second, I gotta update everything, it takes forever. That's what puberty is like, right? They were charged up, they were getting all this stuff, and all of a sudden they're like, buffering. So that's kind of the overall developmental look at what neurology is doing.
And I think this is a great visual to really support what we're talking about today around early elementary and early interventions in children. And it supports the research about why it's easier to introduce a second language in elementary. When you just look at that visual of the possibilities that are there and how quickly our children in elementary age can learn new topics, new pathways of social and emotional development. So now we're going to get into this is a diagram that shows childhood experiences. And while everyone's experience is unique, in this example, we're going to talk about this top flight of children who grow up really in a mean and dangerous environment. It's highly unpredictable. Abuse, neglect, chronic experiences that child adapts to and becomes very skilled at being able to meet their own needs, to be able to assess situations, what's safe, what isn't safe. And that part of the brain that controls fight, flight, and freeze becomes highly skilled and highly attuned to their environments. And they've learned to survive in some of the worst of conditions, but they've also learned to meet their own needs. You see these children in your classrooms who've had repeated situations of abuse or neglect, and then they come into our environments, and you start to see that they are responding to those social situations differently than other students. On the bottom, what you see is another track with children who grow up in a nurturing, safe environment. They learn early on that adults are safe, that they're there to meet our needs, to help them. And they start to develop very positive pro-social skills, because that's what's been communicated and nurtured in them. And they learn to survive in the best of situations, where they use words to express what their needs are. If they're feeling unsafe, if they feel like there's safety issues, they come to an adult and they express that. And we're going to talk about how that then translates to their skills and how it impacts your environments in a classroom. And to give you an example of that, I like to think about two different children in this case that wake up in the middle of the night with a nightmare. The child that's learned that they have to survive through those situations on their own, that if they wake up in the middle of the night crying, there may not be a parent who comes to their bedroom to soothe them and to help them through that. They may stay awake through the night, afraid. It may affect them in the morning when they wake up and come to your classroom. And the child below is a child that when they have a nightmare, a parent comes in and holds them and nurtures them, soothes them, explains to them that it was a nightmare, helps them calm their body. And so we start to see how the child on the bottom, through those processes with adults, learn things like mindfulness, how to calm their body, how to stop crying, to see adults as someone who helps them through that process, as opposed to the child on the top who may have even been punished for coming out of their room in the middle of the night or acting like a baby. And you start to see those differences in childhood experiences and how that develops into a different skill set.
And so one question that we would pose is,
You didn't see that
what
slide.
kinds of careers might those characteristics be useful for? And I think you saw things like emergency medical services, firefighting. I'm going to say teaching. I'm going to say counseling. I'm going to say a lot of places where you're always engaged in a heightened way. And I think it's important to remember that this is a strength-based framework, right? So we're not asking what's wrong with you. We're asking what's happened to you. And it's not that these characteristics are maladaptive. What we're talking about is someone who has really developed in an environment during critical periods of the developmental stages are going to acquire different characteristics. And so working with those in a strength-based way is what we're encouraging us to do, right?
And so again, the child who's grown up in a more chaotic, unpredictable environment, when they become an adult, when they're working in a highly stressful, unpredictable environment, doesn't go into panic in those situations because they're well adapted to that. But then we move into looking at it in your classrooms. It's when those adaptations that our children have come into conflict with what our expectations are. And we see that in our children. When we look at a child who is in the classroom, who's lived in a highly chaotic environment, who's had significant traumas, they have a higher resting heart rate. They're always on edge. They're looking. If someone walks into the door, they may experience a fight, flight, or freeze response that isn't appropriate to the environment, but based on their life experience, they have to always be assessing that situation. And so we start to see where they have a hard time sitting quietly for an extended period of time, or when other children feel calm and feel like it's the classroom is quiet and everybody's working, the child who's been in more of a stressful, unpredictable, and chaotic environment wants to create that environment because that feels normal to them. And so those expectations or those adaptations really come into conflict. Another quick example of this played out is maybe at recess on the playground. So a child who's lived in a more unpredictable environment, who has to solve things on their own, is out there and a kid comes running by and knocks them down. And then that child is coming back around. So the child on that unpredictable environment knows it's up to them to protect themselves and resolve that. So when that kid comes by, what do? They shove them, or they trip them, or they do something, but they don't turn to an adult. And the child on the other, who learns that adults are there to help us and protect us, would likely come to an adult and say, I've been hurt, someone has hurt me, I need your help. They may not use those words, but that's what they learn to do. And you start to see how then they get a different response from adults based on their life experience. And we're here to just kind of talk about that, so we see things a little bit differently in the children and in their behavior.
And so, Gary, I see that you have said addicted to drama, right? And I just want to acknowledge that it's, yes, the way that we become wired is we're always in an environment of fight, flight, or freeze. So it creates a higher, like just a bigger personality, a bigger taking up of space. And so drama, yes. And also I have heard this, where there's trauma, there is drama. And I don't really love generalizations like that. And I think it just invites us to think about, man, if this relationship feels hard with a kid, if this relationship feels hard with an adult, think about, like, what is your framework for who these people are? Because we all have different experiences, and their experiences, just like ours, are dictating our behaviors.
And I want to just talk about, this is why I'm so passionate about this research in catching up to the brain and the neurological development of children. Because of those feedback loops, we can quickly see how a child who has lived through trauma at a very early age gets those negative feedback loops from adults, from systems, and they unintervened continue through adolescence and adulthood. And it becomes harder to change those pathways. But the really hopeful and exciting research is showing, just as we looked at the children in elementary school, how many possibilities they have to make new connections, how much easier, just like it's easier for them to learn a second language, it's easier and quicker for those to make new adaptations. And so this little guy that's staring at you with that silly grin is just an example of how I think more quickly they can reattach and realign to people who take the research and respond to them differently. So you look at the engagement with that little feller there, or girl, who's grinning. We have a strong emotional attachment, as opposed to the second one, where a child, maybe it was looked at as willful disobedience, and gets that negative feedback loop. And so our challenge today is that we start to look at it differently. We look at those behaviors, those adaptations, as opportunities to create new skills, new pathways for children who've been traumatized.
So the one thing to recognize about ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, is they affect people differently. They affect people depending upon the type of maltreatment that they experience, the gender that they are, male or female, and then the age that they are when the maltreatment occurs.
We're going to talk a little bit about how the brain develops from the brain stem up and forward, and early on, that limbic system that regulates our body, our breathing, our blood flow, our hormones, our heart rate, and sexual behavior. And when children experience significant traumas repeatedly, that part of the brain becomes highly developed. And more quickly, we and children move into the fight, flight, or freeze response. And it's not a cognitive thought process of that, it's a biological reaction to some stimulus. Could be smell, sight, sounds, similar experiences that create that biological response for them. For children who have that trauma experience, it interferes with their ability to learn, their memory. It also makes them immune to or resistant to a reward and reinforcement system. And so it's less effective for traumatized children because they repeatedly go into that fight, flight, or freeze. And so we know when you move into a fight, flight, or freeze, the blood flow moves away from our extremities and our brain to our large muscle groups. It ramps us up so we can get away from the saber-toothed tiger. And we can be prepared to survive. And that happens, and you've seen that in children who have a limbic response, either in your classroom or in your interactions with children, young adults, where they have that, it seems out of the ordinary and inappropriate for the situation that's occurring. And for us being able to recognize that when it happens and help them regulate when they're unable to regulate, to come alongside them.
So in looking at maltreatment, if any of you are familiar with Dr. Bruce Perry, he has done a lot of research on the maltreatment impact to the brain 0 to 3. And what we know is as a fetus develops in utero, it also becomes vulnerable to maltreatment. So what we know now is pregnant women, so working with families, pregnant women are susceptible to that environment being a part of the biology of the fetus. So when we talk about 0 to 3, we're talking about some of the most impactful development in a child's life. And what we know is there is some research that connects 0 to 3 happenings developmentally with behavior as adolescents and adults. We'll get into why that might happen. But the amygdala can physically be a bigger part of the brain in people who experience chronic toxic stress. And it's important to understand when you're a little kiddo and you may have this enlarged amygdala, your reaction 0 to 100 is going to be far, far quicker than anybody else in the class. In fact, I was having a conversation with my son last night, just to give you an example. I said something very innocuous like, hey, did you pick up the letter from the table? No, why are you asking me? And I said, hey, man. And what I said was, he said, oh, I'm just joking, because he reacted quickly. And I said, are you joking, or did you just have an inappropriate reaction in a disproportionate way? He goes, oh yeah, that's what happened. So sometimes as we have those conversations with our kiddos, like just naming, I'm noticing that was really disproportionate to what I meant. And they might even just acknowledge that. So sometimes being able to notice with kids what's happening and being able to name it can be helpful. So 0 to 3 is really impactful. And then the age of 0 to 5 in males for sexual abuse has some really detrimental effects on neurology. Oh, and the cerebellar vermis is my favorite part of the brain. Fun to say at parties. This part of the brain is the seat of mental health in our brain. And this is where we get all of our positive feelings. This is how we perceive. Have you ever heard like read the room? That's where the read the room technology comes from, right? Are we able to see what people are doing? Are they looking scary, or are they just having a good time? And sometimes we're not able to differentiate. Interestingly enough, adolescents, just by typical brain development, do not have the skills the same as adults for identifying what your face might be conveying. So I may think I look friendly. Actually, when I'm teaching, I have done this on video as research, and I don't look friendly. I kind of look grouchy. However, I think it's really important to know that people might not be picking up what you're putting down, and that's kind of important to think about, right? The other thing is, this is a part of the brain that hosts all the neurotransmitters, so serotonin, cortisol, dopamine, and it is also very much the part of the brain affiliated with addiction, attention problems, and mental illness. And so what we know is people who have had horrific examples of trauma and abuse in their background can often have symptoms that look like even up to schizophrenia. They may talk to themselves, but if it's addressed as trauma, it can be actually mitigated through appropriate channels. But I think it's important to acknowledge that our system isn't quite at a place where we think about trauma first. Often we'll identify people with an addiction, we'll say they have attention deficit disorder, they might have bipolar. It's just interesting to notice that what some of the top 5 diagnoses in mental health for adolescents and for children are exactly the symptoms that tell us this is a trauma experience. So just noticing that and thinking about our narrative around kids who may have ADHD, about their families, what we're trying to do is really challenge the narrative that we have based on kind of old learning, what that looks like in a classroom.
And this is where I'd like to make a connection to many of the interventions, and we start to move into how does this relate to my classroom, to the children that I'm working with. And so we look at those behaviors and responses that often look like attention deficit that may be trauma responses. And we understand, if we're looking at that as an ADHD, that there are interventions that we can do that can help children be more successful in our expectations, in our classrooms, and in learning. And similarly, for children who've been traumatized, being able to look at that not as what's wrong with them, but what's happened to them. And we don't need to know the specifics, but we can see that this is a child who has a hard time sitting quietly for an extended period of time. They may need adaptations to be able to manage that. We think of things like taking brain breaks so they can learn how to regulate their emotions or what they're feeling, get those, get all of that energy released so then they can come back. And you guys know this better than us, that in your classroom, you have the continuum of children who, from those who can't hardly sit still for 5 minutes to those who meet those expectations well. And so trying to create those interventions that allow the child who's had significant trauma be able to learn how to self-regulate, calm their body, and you come alongside them and help them regulate. And so this slide just says children who have experienced 4 or more ACEs are 3 times as likely to take ADHD medication when compared with children with less than 4 ACEs. And again, how that research is really explaining some of how trauma impacts our children. And back to that previous slide, those medications are directly targeted at the cerebellar vermis and the release of appropriate levels of chemicals. It also links, so just moving to adolescence, when I was at the Wyoming Girls School and working with girls in treatment, many of them who had been addicted or abused methamphetamine, this part of the brain had been depleted from substance abuse. And so the repair that needs to happen so they can start to feel joy, start to feel hope, and start to be able to experience positive emotions again. And that's through a healing process. But those medications assisting our children are often used to target this and improve. But it's critically important that they learn the skills to be able to do that as well.
So thinking about adolescent development, this part of the brain, the corpus callosum, is the bridge between the two hemispheres of the brain. And so this is the part of the brain that interacts with each other, and it actually starts to develop more abstract thinking, higher level processing skills, higher level relational skills. And it also has an impact on, let's say, processing novel situations. So if you have a kiddo, for example, who can come in one morning and gets all the math facts right, and you're thinking, okay, you've got it, man, we're good to go, you can do this. And then the next day they come in and they look at you like you have three heads. I don't know what you're talking about. How do I carry this number in this problem? What we're experiencing is the inability to take one situation and recreate it the next day. And really, it's important to understand that our ability to do something is dependent on our state of being. So thinking back to the amygdala, what we want to remember is if a child has demonstrated a skill and cannot do it consistently every single day, then what you know is that child, on the day that they're not able to function or to demonstrate skill mastery, that child is not regulated. And so instead of thinking like you didn't do the teaching right, they just didn't retain it, remember the amygdala and the hippocampus are part of a memory system. So if I can't remember it, it's because I'm dysregulated and that fight, flight, or freeze is taking over my body. Even if it doesn't look like an outburst, what it might look like is dissociated. What it might look like is I am sitting back and looking like I don't care because I'm missing information and I can't do it, and engaging is really hard. The other thing is, let's say I'm able to get dressed every morning and have breakfast in my own house. But as soon as I have to do it with my sports team in a hotel, I don't eat because I don't know what I'm supposed to do. That might be a really bonkers example. But what I'm trying to demonstrate is there's also like things that you learn in one situation often transfer to other situations. So we're like, oh, this is like that. But people who have impacts to the corpus callosum will often not be able to think that way. So we have to really help them with processing, with how do we transfer information. And this is really important, like in elementary school, because we have a lot of interventions, right? If I'm teaching you reading and I'm thinking, wow, look, this computer program or whatever my measurement is, demonstrating that you're doing a good job shows improvement. The question should really be, are we seeing a generalized pattern of that behavior of reading improving in all other areas of your learning? Because that's what we want to check, not just can you do this in isolation, but can you do this everywhere? That's how skill development happens. The other thing that's kind of important biologically, if I might, is there are little seedling cells that are planted in your brain when you're just a little fetus. And these parts of your brain are kind of like planting a garden, and they start to grow only in adolescence. And if those little seedling cells can be damaged or wiped away from chronic toxic stress, because your body's only meant to be in chronic toxic stress or in stress 20 minutes, right? So the more that happens over, and you might relate to this, like during these times of our lives, you might relate to that, like, hey man, I don't ever feel like I can just take a breath and like truly relax. And so people who have that kind of toxic stress that kicks them into fight, flight, or freeze over and over and over again, our body's not designed for that. It holds on to cortisol and all the adrenaline, all that stuff flushes through your body. And if we can't get rid of it effectively and it just keeps staying there, that's what starts to impact our physiological being. So our organs and our cells are impacted negatively because cortisol, adrenaline, and all of those fight, flight, or freeze neurotransmitters and chemicals, they actually start to to become toxic to us. So that's what I wanted to say about the seedling.
Yeah, and I just want to reinforce two really key concepts in this that relate to the classroom, and that is we can have a tendency to interpret this wrong when you and we get caught in it by seeing a child, as Wendy talked about, who yesterday was able to retrieve facts, was able to spell those words, was able to put that together. And today they come in and it's like it's a whole different kid. What happened? And we can get into the trap of looking at that and thinking about it as willful, that they are just not working hard enough, they're distracted, they're disobedient. And really what's happened is they can't retrieve that information because of their mindset of where they're at, what might have happened last night, what might have happened today, or what they're worried about. They might not know who's going to pick them up from school. Any number of things that for the traumatized child interrupts that superhighway in the Corpus Callosum. And so it's not that the children lack, that it's not a willful disobedience, it's that they lack the skill to be able to do that in times of stress or when they're reacting. And I think that's just a really important distinction of when we see kids who do it one day and don't do it the next day. And I don't remember what the next thing I was going to reinforce on that, but it will. And but it's just a critical way for us to, again, check our perception of what's happening.
So the other way I want to challenge our narrative about some of these things that we don't even think about is how we're thinking about behavior, right? If you look at research, neglect in infancy for boys has a huge impact in adolescent behavior, and that's those seedling cells. If they become disrupted in growth because of early chronic toxic stress, or they become damaged in that way, that will not show up until adolescence. So we're talking 5th, 6th grade, and I have taught 4th, 5th, and 6th grade in special education. And what I can tell you is 5th grade, I don't know what happens, but there's a whole other social context going on. And then by the second semester of 6th grade, everyone has become like hormonally imbalanced, in my opinion. And I just want to say that in some cases, kids look like their behavior is maybe a result of peer groups, which is possible and an added component. But what we know is the protective factors were not in place early on. So boys, particularly who have neglect in infancy, might look kind of rough in adolescence. And instead of thinking, well, now they just turned into this willful, horrible person, our narrative might be, something may have happened way back in infancy that's affecting what's happening now. Again, skill development. And sexual abuse in girls from ages of 9 and 10, which is highly specific, I understand. But Dr. Tiger from Harvard University has done a lot of research on brain development using fMRIs and different maltreatment kinds of impacts to brains. And that's what they've discovered. So just acknowledging that sometimes what happened early on does not become apparent until later. And that way of showing us that happened looks like behavior.
And so one of in the research on how we can take this information and incorporate it into our classroom again is the concept of dosing, and you all are doing that, and so we just want to reinforce that dosing, and so what that looks like is for us as the professionals of being able to monitor the tone of the classroom. And when we know that energy level is going up for some of our students, being able to take those brain breaks, being able to regulate them. And we know that learning new information is stressful. And so again, that remembering that our brain and our body is only intended to be in toxic stress for no more than 20 minutes. It gives us the research behind why we introduce topics, which raises the stress level. And this could be from a skill standpoint as well, a behavioral or social context. We introduce that information. We work through that, but then we have to let the stress be relieved, to calm. It's like interval training for our muscle groups and fitness training, the same for our brain. We create that interval training where we bring that up, whether that's our heart rate, introducing new information, and then we might do review of what's known so that the stress level comes back, and then we reintroduce or review a new concept again. And just making sure that we are dosing that based on the ability of the children that are in our classroom, and just keeping in mind and keeping a gauge on how our children are doing with that information. Same thing for parents. If we're engaging parents in a conversation about their child, really trying to be aware of when you start to feel that the parent is becoming escalated, agitated, stressed, then to move away from that topic for a minute, co-regulate with them to bring them down, so then we can come back and talk about it, are just really great skills to continue to reinforce that. So we're going to talk just a little bit about bullying. The research is showing that our children are acutely sensitive to what our brain perceives as bullying, which can look like shame and guilt and emotional bullying. And what's interesting about the research for me is that the brain does not differentiate between whether that is from peers or parents, or peers and adults in their system, so or that they come into contact with. And it's again acutely, the brain is acutely sensitive in that developmental stage between 7 and 13. And it gives us why the importance of bullying prevention, to intervening for children who feel bullied and hurt. And then I can't help in my work to think about what's happening with children developmentally between the ages of 7 and 13. Some of the sexual identity development that's occurring in the later part of that developmental stage, and then social media. Many of our children between the ages of 7 and 13 are having access to social media, phones, and things that, if unmonitored, can create social bullying. And just again, the importance of making sure we're aware of and attuned to our children and preventing bullying.
So collectively, we have a choice, and we want to now move into some of the data from the initial ACEs studies that were started in 1994.
So the ACE study was started by Dr. Folletti, who was with Kaiser Permanente, large healthcare company in California. And in Dr. Folletti had noticed in his practice a link between adult chronic health condition and early child trauma. And in that example, what he had found is the link between morbid obesity and childhood sexual abuse. And he started to think, are there other chronic health conditions that may be rooted in childhood trauma and childhood experiences? And he developed through a large sampling of questions and participants through Kaiser Permanente, the ACE study. And the original ACE study looked at insured people with Kaiser Permanente, and they were primarily white, well-educated, middle class, all had insurance, most employed, And through that study, he found 10 childhood experiences that were highly correlated to adult chronic health conditions. And he connected with Dr. Anda. And Dr. Anda is the person who helped develop this training with Laura Porter from the University of Washington, Walla Walla, and provided training to us. But what they found, what Dr. Anda did was through the Center for Disease Control, picked up this study and determined that it was applicable to the general population across age and gender and socioeconomic and regional differences. And so we're going to talk just briefly about that ACE study, those 10 highly correlated traumas for our children.
So the Adverse Childhood Experiences study started in 1994 and has been ongoing for about 20 years. I believe they just closed it out a couple of years ago. And Dr. Anda was the overseeing research coordinator for that. So what we want to look at is what are the common adverse childhood experiences. So household dysfunction, neglect, and abuse are the overarching umbrellas of specific abuse experiences. So that might look like substance abuse or substance use in the home, parental separation and divorce, mental illness within the home, domestic violence or intimate partner violence, criminality in the home, and then emotional and physical neglect and emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. So those are sort of the 10 that they came up with, 10, 15 years ago when they were first documenting and starting to look at what this looks like. And remember, these are epidemiologists, right? People who study disease. And so their concern is always to find out the etiology. That's a special education word, right? We want to find out the etiology. Where does this come from? What's happening in the beginning of something that creates this response? And so in looking at it from a public health perspective, looking at the root cause of something, they noticed that early adverse childhood experiences resulted in adult outcomes that were far more negative for people who had experienced several ACEs in their life. And I want to say 2 caveats here, because the ACE community, if you go on to, I believe it's aceconnection.org, they have great articles all the time on different ACE related information. And some of the chatter that's happening among ACE community members who are trying to really move this forward for teachers and community members and agency workers. One is there really isn't, you'll notice there's nothing here that addresses like racial oppression. There's nothing that addresses like death of a parent or loss of a primary caregiver. So Dr. Anda and his team would acknowledge very quickly that these are very limited in terms of what they were studying. And you could add a whole, whatever you're thinking about is probably something that you could add as a traumatic experience. The other thing is this is self-reported based on your experience. So siblings may have really different experiences. One sibling may experience 2 maybe adverse childhood experiences. One may have experienced 5. So self-reported. And the other thing I would say is we're going to talk about the ACE study survey, which was used to gather information, but it is only used to gather information from a group. It is not intended to be an assessment tool. It's not intended to be given to anybody under 18 years old. So it's not appropriate to ask somebody in your classroom who's in the 5th grade, like, hey, do you have any substance users in your home? You can mentally maybe note that, and it doesn't really even matter what a child's ACE score is. Our narrative, again, is to think about not how many traumas the child has endured, and not what's wrong with them, but maybe just think about what's happened and how impactful onto our physiology that adverse childhood experiences can be. So looking just at the ACE scores, do you want to go to the next slide, Clark? Thanks. There is only 1/3 of us who have an ACE score of 0. 2/3 of us have one adverse experience in our life or more. And so those percentages that you see on your screen are the percentages of people who say they have 1, 2, 3, 4 ACEs. People with 4 and above ACE scores are 16%. And that is sort of an arbitrary, well, it's not, it's research-based, really. It's evidence-based cutoff of people who experience 4 or more ACEs are more likely to encounter negative health outcomes than those with 4 or less.
And so again, bringing this back to your classroom, and I think it's important for us to look at that, is it's representative often of our community's experiences with adverse childhood experiences. So if you think of your classroom as having 1/3 of your children have not experienced trauma in their life or traumatic experiences, but 1/3 of yours or 2/3 of your classroom have experienced 1 or more adverse childhood experiences. And given the age of the students you're working with, that may have occurred recently or be occurring. And again, what Dr. Anda, from my work in working with adolescents, is this is not an assessment instrument to be used with children. It's not intended to ask children about their childhood experiences or traumas, but to know when you see behaviors or children who are struggling, children who appear to be sad, to recognize, again, it's not what's wrong with them, but what's happened or what might be happening in that situation. And I think what's so powerful about that is it changes how we view the child and the behavior. And a great example that I use in training with our staff and professionals is if you had a small child of 2 to 3 who you know was hurt and is crying, and something happened and they're having a temper tantrum, it's easy to recognize that we need to pick them up, to hold them, nurture them, to be able to show kindness and help them calm down. And as our children get older and those behaviors become more difficult to witness and experience, a child punching a hole in the wall or using foul language or pushing another student down, we have a tendency to look at that as behavior that needs to be punished or consequenced, as opposed to looking at it from what's happened, what's the reaction from, what trauma might be triggered, and to look at utilizing those cool down tactics. And I know I'm moving into the next part of our training, but why understanding the frequency of ACEs in our populations is important is because we know that 2/3 of the children in your classroom have likely experienced trauma.
So I'm sorry, I'm just going to interrupt and say, just being cognizant of time, we want to make sure that we get to the practical parts. And Joseph, I did notice that you asked for the slides and the information in the charts, and those are available through the course information, and there's a link to that. All right, Clark.
So we're going to show you just a couple of how the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, the higher your score, puts us at higher risk. And as Wendy said, it's not predictive on the individual level, it's predictive at the community level. And so it's important that we acknowledge as we talk about ACEs, that this is really a hopeful message, that knowledge is power. And if we know we're at higher risk, we can do something about it. And so as we look at this chart, we're going to show you a couple of them. On the left axis is the percentage of risk or percentage of health problems. And across the y-axis at the bottom is the frequency of ACEs. So as you can see, if I have an ACE score of 4 or more, I'm at 13% higher risk for early smoking initiation. And so, and Dr. Anda talked to us about, that's at age 12 or earlier. So when we think about why and the impact of ACEs in smoking or use of tobacco products, now we look at vaping, that early initiation of using tobacco as a coping strategy for some of those emotional needs. We're also then 16, 17% more likely to be a current smoker if we have 4 or more ACEs, and we're 8 times more likely to develop COPD. And again, just to recognize, tobacco can be an effective calming self-medication for anxiety and depression and difficult concentrating. And so it creates a feedback loop that if I'm struggling, and again, remember a child with 4 or 5 adverse childhood experiences going on in their home, it becomes very difficult to come into school or other environments and remain focused and calm.
I like what Dr. Folletti says. So if nicotine is super helpful for you, if you feel like, you know, when you're an adolescent and you can't sit still and people are really giving you negative feedback about not being able to do that, and you discover nicotine, you're like, this feels wonderful. And so then it becomes addictive because we know that there's addictive properties to that. It's just interesting that when we find a solution that looks like nicotine, when we try and give cessation classes, what we're saying is, hey man, your solution doesn't work. Actually, we're saying we're taking away your solution because you found a solution that did work. So thinking about when we're asking people to do something different, we're taking away their solution, and for them, that solution has been effective. So it really asks us to be thoughtful about what we're asking people to do. So ACEs and depression, very quickly, not a surprise that people with 4 or more ACEs have a much higher rate of depression. And I think it's important to think about that affects your motivation level, your energy level, your ability to focus, your ability to get out of bed. Just a lot of things that even as when we look at families, when we think about why parents might not be able to engage with us, they may have their own negative feedback loops, but they might also have depression or anxiety that really creates isolation for them and does not promote engagement with school staff.
And I just want to comment on the slide. I mean, obviously it shows that if a woman has 4 or more ACEs, they're 60% more likely to suffer from depression. And it says 39% of males suffering from depression. And as a male, I would just challenge that I suspect that's more underrepresentation and also not identifying what I'm experiencing and attributing it to depression. And so more reporting than it is about truly suffering from the effects of adverse childhood experiences in depression.
I also want to see, like, the dose response here is you can see suicide among people with 0 adverse childhood experiences versus the amount of suicide attempts of people with 4 or higher suicide attempts is significant. And I think that that invites us to think about, what do our prevention programs look like and what are they targeting? Because obviously when we come to a place of suicide attempts, we are at a place that feels hopeless. We're at a place that we don't see the world like the people want us to be able to see it. And so what does prevention look like in suicide attempts? And how do we take into account trauma-informed care when we talk about suicide?
And we'll make those correlations for you in a little bit on what we look at, how we can put preventive factors in place to help offset the traumas. And so these are examples of ACE attributable problems in adults: alcoholism, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, depression, mental health issues, depression, fetal death, obesity, and a variety of other workplace problems as well. And when, again, it's not predictive on the individual level. So if I have 4 or more ACEs, that doesn't mean that these are all of the health-related problems I'm going to have because of protective factors. And we'll talk about that. But it's like knowing what my cholesterol score is. If I have a higher cholesterol score, it doesn't mean that I'm going to die of a heart attack at age 50. It means that I might be at higher risk. And there are some things I might want to put into place to help with that. If I know a child has trauma, if I know that they have several ACEs, I can assist them with putting those protective factors on that, offset that, and reduce those risks. And so as we look at those attributable risks, this is if we can reduce ACEs. If you can eliminate ACEs, we can reduce marijuana use by 54%. If we can reduce or eliminate ACEs, we can reduce suicide by 67%. So it can have a profound impact on our children and young adults. And I think what's important about this, what Dr. Anda challenged us in providing this training and getting the information out, is our first goal is no more ACEs. So our challenge to you is in our environments, in the children that we come into contact with, that we have a trauma-informed approach and environment that is safe and nurturing, that helps our children learn the skills they need to meet our expectations, to be successful, and to use that trauma-informed approach so that we don't create institutional trauma. And one example, when we were presenting this to an elementary school, at the end of that, the principal came up and said, you know, yesterday I had a student that was sent to my class or sent to my office, and they were just, their behavior was off the chart. And I immediately called the parents, and the parents came in. And if I would have thought about this from an ACEs standpoint ahead of time, I think I would have handled it much differently, because in my experience with that child, and I knew the family, and I knew that there were likely significant ACEs in this situation. And I sent that child home without helping the parents with a plan. And he said, I worried all night long about, were there more ACEs that were experienced by that child last night that I might have been able to respond differently. So when we look at that attributable risk, it is interrelated to what we do individually, but what we also do collectively.
So this is a familiar narrative, right? We have adaptations to toxic stress that look like learning, attention, and behavior problems. That translates into academic failure, early substance use. We drop out of school maybe, and then we encounter adult adversity. And so what's really interesting is, as a teacher, you can only do so much, right? And I think it's just important to think about, how are you contributing to this narrative? Is there something with cognition, with attention, with behavior that you can address early on in your classroom that might help divert the rest of this narrative? So moving along.
Yeah, and so what we're really looking at here is the impact of adverse childhood experiences on development, on disrupting neurodevelopment, disrupting social emotional development, creating cognitive impairment, adoption of those health risks that we just showed, disease and disability. And as those adverse childhood experiences go untreated, unrecognized, it leads to earlier death. But it also gives us some example of how those can be transmitted intergenerationally from one generation to the next. And again, our goal being no more childhood experiences. And obviously we can't erase an adverse childhood experience that a child has experienced, but generationally, again, our goal is to reduce that. And it's interesting to think about. When I made the error in thinking about, man, having a generational impact to lower ACEs seems like a long way out, and it's hard to get that return. And Dr. Anda challenged us. We can have a generational impact of lowering ACEs now. Because if you're working with someone, a parent of childbearing age, and providing them with information, knowledge on how they can prevent the transmission of ACEs to their children or grandchildren, we're having the impact on that next generation of lowering it.
So we want to move forward and talk about what are some of the things that we can be mindful of as classroom teachers, right, to change the dynamic of ACEs. So the core protective factors that we're going to talk about is the capabilities, you can change it, Clark, attachment and belonging, and the community culture and spirituality. So very quickly, capabilities are a strength-based framework. So looking at this person in front of you and maybe feeling frustrated, flipping the switch from saying, you know, this part of whatever you're doing is maddening or it's creating an annoyance in me. What we want to ask is, what are these strengths? Remember, we talked about adaptations can look like really effective tools when you're a firefighter or a police officer or a military person, because you're really good in stressful situations. So how can we both develop a strength-based framework and teach skills at the same time? Because we want to be able to teach those skills. How do you act quiet when the room is quiet? The other thing is attachment and belonging in your classroom. What does that look like? Trauma-informed classrooms work off the premise that your class is a family. And families don't really let people out of the herd, right? Your family is your family. You may have a brother or sister who is really, you click with, and one you don't. And you know what? You're still family. So that's what a trauma-informed classroom looks like. It looks like you're here. I love you no matter what. Some teachers use that language. They talk about the amygdala. They talk about some of the neurology stuff that we talked about in very simplistic ways. And there's lots of information on where to find that if you Google it, because you can Google anything. So what we want to remember is everyone is here is a family, and we're going to keep you safe. That's my job. So remember when we talked about how, you know, that early part of nurturing, we want to be the parent that's nurturing. So if there's a child behaving in a way that kind of, you know, gets your own heart rate going, that's a question for you to be asking, because remember, you're the adult in the room. And looking at the community and culture and spirituality of a room. So thinking about what are our cultural narratives that we're bringing in here. And that includes what are expectations around, you know, maybe somebody with a different culture, or who maybe has a different skin color, or perhaps children who might go off to special education during the day, or who may have hearing impairments. What we want to do is we want to talk about those things openly and honestly. We want to create a culture that is inclusive. And so that requires that we know maybe a little bit more than what we know in the beginning, but we create cultures around inclusiveness and around caring and around nurturing.
And as Wendy said, we can look at that of how do we do that? How do we create a trauma-informed environment within our classroom and in our other contexts that we have in our family, in our church, in our youth group, whatever those are, but using those three core protective factors that build resilience. And so it's important that we don't look at that and say, you know, is that really my job in the classroom to do these three things? And I can hear you. you're saying, we do that. You are doing that. Those capabilities are those aha moments when our kids learn those new skills, where you're celebrating their successes in creating that hope and belief that they have that I can accomplish. And so at any age, those endorphins, those endorphin hits that we get and we give when those skills are attained, and then that attachment and belonging. And this is just, we see research around things like, why do mentorship programs work? Because they do these three things. They create attachment and belonging. We have relationships. You have relationships with your students and their parents. We create this bond with them. And we might think, well, I'm only going to have them for a year. But think about people that you've had in your life. Think back to who inspired you. Who did you have that was a role model for you, who believed in you unconditionally? When I've asked that questions in trainings, I hear things like a teacher, my grandma, a neighbor who took me, spent time with me. And then we ask, well, how long was that teacher or that coach in your life? And I think of at my age, I have a couple of those who were only in my life for a year, but had a huge impact on how I viewed myself and what motivated me to overcome some obstacles. So again, when we look at this about building resilience, it's something we pass on, and it gets passed on to the next teacher and the next, and we create that community within our schools that build resilience in our children, and that community culture and spirituality of lifting them up beyond what's happened to them so that it's hopeful.
So thinking about protective factors, those are really important for our families. And particularly in early childhood and elementary school, how are we connecting with our parents and our families? And I've already heard like some really great things that people are doing to bring in families into their schools. And what I want to just invite us to do is think about how can we be even better, right? Think about the interactions you have with parents. Oftentimes, the interactions that we have, I know, and I'll just speak for Campbell County, we have parent-teacher conferences once a year. And I just want to know, like, the teachers are inviting parents to come in any time. And we have one time of year when we invite them in. And the other thing is, what are we talking about? Are we giving information that says your kid is great, I love having them? Or, hey, your kid is really struggling, let me tell you again how and why. So we have lots of those conversations. How many conversations do we have about, hey, what's going on in your family? Are you having a hard time? Are there any resources that you might need? Again, knowing that we do all of these things already. One thing I want to ask us to consider is, have we thought about how to teach our families how to be protected from chronic toxic stress? And that looks like teaching parental resilience. How do we teach parents resilience? I don't know about you, but during this pandemic thing, my stress level has increased. And if you're a teacher and yours hasn't, I kind of don't believe you. So thinking about how does resilience feel? This is what overwhelm feels like. Some people are here all the time. And right now we're getting acquainted with it because maybe we don't live like this all the time. So what strategies are you using to be resilient? Are there days that you don't even feel resilient? Because that's what our families sometimes feel like. We're here and they might be up here. How do we create social connections, not between us and families, but between families in our community? Because one thing we know is neighborhoods are protective, right? If we have people in our community who know our children, who look out for them, then our kids are safer and they're developmentally better off. So how do we form connections with parents, with other families within our schools? And then how are we teaching our parents about child development? In Klein, Wyoming, when I teach the moms who live in Campbell County who are in our program, we always talk about make sure you know what the development stage of your kiddo is, because if you're expecting them to do 5-year-old things and they're 3, you're going to be super frustrated, and that's going to create stress in your parenting. So teaching our parents what's appropriate for developmental ages and recognizing that there's a large continuum in terms of how kids meet that kind of lowers the stress, right? Like, let them take a break and understand not everything is a crisis or an emergency in development. And then providing concrete support in times of need, right? Our community in Campbell County, and maybe yours as well, is kind of a 24/7 community. Resources are available from 9 to 5. So looking at some of those, how do we provide concrete support? If a parent calls me and says, oh my gosh, this is happening, and you think, okay, we need to send you here, we need to get you there, how are you providing that in a concrete way? If you are referring somebody, that's not concrete support. So thinking about how can I support the family without necessarily just referring them. And then you're also growing that skill within the family, right? Like, you don't want to be the person that's doing that all the time. You're growing that social emotional competence, not just of the parents, but if you do it for the parents, then you do it for the kids, and the kids reap that reward.
Here's a great visual to look at how we do classroom management and help children identify where they're at in terms of their stress level and their ability to process and learn new things. So it just from a addressing behavior standpoint, if the child is in the escalated stage or in red, they are unable to hear. Again, remember, they're having a limbic response. So all of the blood is flowing away from their frontal cortex to their large muscle groups. They're not hearing a word that you're saying. They're not able to process what they can do differently and how they're going to do that differently. Same thing for us. And I do a lot of training with our staff around understanding when we have a limbic response, when we want to fight, which is usually around giving consequences or discipline, when we want to flight or run, which means I want to just avoid this situation and this child in this situation, or fight, flight, or freeze, when we just shut down, ignore it completely, and don't come back and address it. But being able to see where we're at in this and making sure that the child is in the green, so they're calm and we're calm, and then we can sit down and process that. And I often think about this just in a visual as a timeout. So the child is, in a younger child, having a tantrum or having a behavioral breakdown. They're out of control. So the first thing we need to do is to get them to stop, to help them regulate, to calm their body. And we can come alongside them through breathing, remaining calm, get them calm. After the timeout, everybody's calm. Then we can start looking at what happened, what to do differently, and coming up with a new agreement. And this is just a visual that can be shared. Could have that in a classroom so kids can start to identify where they're at emotionally, and also shared with parents so they know where they're at and the children are at.
I also, I think, just want to say that ruptures in classrooms are common. It's how we repair that rupture that is super important. And I think because of the way our schools are structured, we don't often have time to repair that. So thinking about, talking about how can we do this differently next time, and understanding it's going to happen the same way for the next 5 times, but you're going to have the same conversation, or maybe you're going to talk about what would be helpful and asking questions rather than just imposing what you think should happen, right? So trauma-informed, so trauma-informed schools is a book by Jim Sporluder and another gal whose name I seriously can't remember right now, and I'm sorry about that. But it outlines month by month what you can do to become a trauma-informed school. And I've just kind of listed some of the things month by month that he suggests that you do. And you'll see the first one is teach students and parents about stress. So we just talked about protective factors and educating parents. So I'm just going to, leave that. If you want to research that or look at his trauma-informed schools book, he is a teacher from Transitional High School in Washington, and he is touted as one of the principals who's done a really super job with trauma-informed care school-wide.
And there's a documentary on the school, Paper Tigers. If you want to learn a little bit more, it's more related to an alternative high school, but there's some great concepts in there. And here's some additional things from his book. I think as we look at the trauma, it's important that we recognize that what comes with trauma often are behaviors and responses to situations. And it's important that we look at those behaviors like we would other learning disabilities. And I talked a little bit about that at the beginning of how we can start to see that as a skill base that needs to be learned, that we can help children understand how to regulate their body, how to calm down. We utilize, even in our elementary programming, a lot of cool down and stress tactics, teaching kids how to do mindfulness, how to take deep breaths and relax and breathe out. Because many of our children, again, when you think about that a child who's raised in a highly stressful, predictable, dangerous environment, they did not get those skills taught or modeled for them. And so our kids, even if they know how to do it, they often lack the ability to do it when they need it, when they're stressed, when they're triggered. And so creating those opportunities for them and creating a culture where we practice them with them so they can access the skills when they need them. So we use a different approach to teach those skills in increments that they can handle. Again, that's talking about that dosing and being able to create and utilize those skills for our children and repetition of being able to use that, especially when they're starting to escalate.
So this is something I teach in Climb, but I think it's appropriate for a classroom. I wish I would have been way more mindful when I was teaching. This is less of a tell and react than ask and respond, right? So recognizing that we also have responses to children and that children their behavior is communication. Like, let's just start by agreeing on that. So this just is an invitation to think about 4 different feelings that you might be having in reaction to a child. So if you have a child that makes you feel particularly annoyed, that's the child who's asking for attention. And you may not be able to give it in that moment, but it's good to know, like, wow, I'm super annoyed by this kid almost every single day. What that child is telling you is they're not getting enough attention from you. And our reaction usually is, I'm annoyed, go sit down. If you want attention, I'm going to not give it to you because you're seeking it inappropriately. What we want to do is engage them and give them lots of attention in times when it's appropriate, because that will help to sort of address those times when they don't feel it, right? They just want you to know, I'm here and I need lots of attention. And the need for attention is different for every kid, right? What if you're feeling angry? Do you ever get like super angry at a kid? That feeling is the feeling of a power struggle. So what that is inviting you to do is to, like, take a deep breath yourself, say, I'm really mad and I need to start giving this kid choices or some kind of power because they're feeling like they're always losing the power struggle. And that's often very common in kids with trauma because they do not trust authority. They need to be in control all the time. So you're having power struggles. That's what angry feels like, power. If you're feeling hurt by something a kid does, like, I cannot believe after all this, he would have done that. That is because he feels hurt, he's hurting you, and he hit the bullseye, right? So that child is seeking revenge because they feel hurt by you. And it's an invitation to, again, repair a relationship potentially. And then what if the child feels like this, I'm trying to remember the word in special education, learned helplessness. When a child is kind of saying, oh, I don't know how to do this all the time, it might be that they feel hopeless about themselves, and also they're creating an opportunity for you to also feel hopeless because nothing you do is working. So learned helplessness is really about no one has a solution and we're all feeling hopeless. So just an invitation to explore those feelings as teachers, and even like, are you even recording those feelings for yourself in a classroom in those moments?
I want to give you just one more example. So we often we go to trainings, we get inspired, we get information, we say, I want to bring this back and implement it. And then we get back to work and we're inundated by everything we have to do in our classrooms, in our work, and we don't always come back to the training that we had. So this was a way that I took trauma-informed approach, put it into cue cards with our staff, where we identified 6 things that we wanted to take from being a trauma-informed approach, and we put it on our swipe badges that every one of us carry. And as I said at the beginning, 35 years I've been working with kids, but I still sometimes, I often react wrong because I have overlearned and overutilized things like rewards and consequences to try to change behavior. And it's bad science. The research shows us it's helping our kids build new skills. So this is one example of how one of our greatest predictors of a situation that escalates, that maybe a school resource officer needs to be involved, or a child gets removed from our classroom. What we have found, what triggered that to that level is often that they received a consequence when they were escalated, and it made it worse. Our intentions are often good. We say things like, if you don't do this, this is going to happen, but the child perceives it as a consequence and a threat. And number 6, it's a catchy statement, fix the future, don't punish the past. But I want to just key in on what that means. Fixing the future is responding to behavior, responding to situations through a skill-based approach that we look at how do we set the stage for tomorrow. So if we're looking at a behavior that was completely inappropriate for that situation, we get the child calm, and then we identify what is a tactic that they can use to not get to that escalation step. And then we ask them to practice it. So the consequence might be, so for the rest of today, twice, I want you to go utilize one of the stress reducers that we have. I want you to recognize when you're getting escalated and put on noise canceling headphones. I want you to use your fidget spinner without disrupting other people, just one time this afternoon. And then we make the connection with them at the end of the day and thank them for utilizing it. And then tomorrow morning, we set the stage for success, where we ask them to make sure that they have the silly putty in their hand or in their desk, on their desk, so they can use it when they want to distract somebody else. And so we start to teach them how to use those things when they need it before it escalates. And those are just examples of some ways to try to create fixing the future instead of punishing the past.
And I think that brings us to the end of our presentation. So just thinking about some of the calm down kits, those are available to look through online, thinking about your students and what might be helpful and how you would enact that in your classroom. So we appreciate your time. Gail, do you have anything that you need to say?
I do. I want to thank Clark and Wendy for being with us today.